Hey, I know all the excuses for wanting to destroy a modern church. Here's some that's given by people. It's ran by man's desires, man's religion. We need to step away from it because it's all nothing but mere flesh. We also need to cry out to those poor saps who are stuck within it. Come out of her, my people. Be not partakers of her sins. However, we cannot call something evil that God himself has ordained. Acts 10:15. We just need to understand it in all of its varied forms. That's all. We need an understanding. You really think that the church, every single church, is completely man's invention? You really think that? Then I'm going to ask you, where else do we gather together to help God's people? Well, I know that one too. The early church had only home meetings, and that's the only thing that God will bless. Are we saying then, with such a thought like that all the people who find themselves within the walls of a church building are simply doomed? That would be a pretty bold statement, and made by those who have either been hurt by one of these terrible dictators that I've been speaking on particularly herein, or has been hurt by other church members and or ministers within its walls. Let's face it, church attendees can either be angels or they can be demons, or they simply haven't been in it long enough to truly understand God's true purpose for such institutions, and etc., etc. But I myself have witnessed miracles within church walls. Who therefore did those miracles therein if God hates the modern church? Even if an evil man is in charge, God can still perform miracles. We see this in Matthew 7:22 through 23. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? See, they did the prophecy. And in your name haven't we cast out devils? See, the devils got casted out. And in your name done many wonderful works. They did many wonderful works for the people. And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. With their own evil hearts. But people still got saved. That's important to understand that. Because it does not have anything to do with those evil leaders, but it has everything to do with the people who want and need God in their lives. Much the same as when Jesus went into the temple to teach. They weren't messages for that evil ministry who held the reins of the temple in that day and time. It was for the people who attended there. So let's be careful of what we consider to be evil. Even if God ordains for there to be evil ministers involved in some churches, as I'm fixing to explain why I said that. Now let's be more like John the Revelator, therefore, who, when beholding the mother of harlots, that he didn't start cursing her, but had instead beheld her wonderment. Revelation 17:6, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. That's going to take a little explaining there itself. Not only, but in consideration of bad ministers being ordained by God to run some of these said churches, as again I'm going to speak on in just a moment, then why is it, one may curiously ask, did Jesus get upset with them during his own day if they were actually doing God's will? That is, at various times, he and his disciples, and even John the Baptist, rebuked them. My own take on this is that when a person has grown up, as I've been contending, and when God has ordained such rebukings and corrections for reasons that are relevant for the moment, he will then prompt a mature minister to do so at the right time for the benefit of the people themselves who are around it that hear it. Let's keep this in mind, that during such circumstances, and of what the writer of Ecclesiastes had to say when he had shown us through his words that to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get, time to lose, time to keep, time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Again, Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. And only a true called minister will understand how and when to do such things in God's kingdom, while supplying godly wisdom and godly discernment to that enterprise. For even though many evil men are called by God to do such and such in his services, there are times, and there will be times, again, for the benefit and education of the learning student, to expose such men for what they truly are. But novices are never allowed to rebuke elders. I don't care what you think. Even if those elders are evil, as, once again, I'm going to get into more detail about in the upcoming pages. Let's also see Acts 23, 1 through 5, 1 Timothy 5, 1 through 2. Once more, it was God himself that has ordained a modern church system in all of its varied and complicated forms, not man. Even if a man can come into it and bend it toward his own direction by God's allowance and ordination. Again, as I'm going to talk on. And yes, and as I've been saying, I do believe that God allows such to happen by the hands of corrupted men. Or, and more to the point of the matter, it was God himself who actually placed that corrupted man into the leadership position therein on purpose. As I spoke of in detail in my already published book, Blaming God, Is It Really His Fault? And I'm also promised to do, I'm going to get into more about this coming up. And, again, we're in chapter 3 here, and I'm trying to still introduce these ideas before I get into the deep details. I want to discuss it first before I get into the deep details. Instead of being for evil reasons, though, what God has done and is still doing. God had actually done such things for our further education through trials and tribulations, because when afflictions come from God, it is always for our benefit and our training, our education, and not for our hurt or our downfall. Please read and meditate on Psalms 119, 71. Look at these in your spare time. Psalms 119, 65 through 68, 73 through 75, Hebrews 5:8, Isaiah 53:4, Romans 8:32a, Philippians 3:10, Psalms 88:7, 15, 90:15, Amos 3:6b, and Genesis 50:20. All of which passages I go over with a fine-tooth comb along with further explanations in my book, Blaming God, Is It Really His Fault? But let's continue. Folks, we'll never be able to get rid of the church until God himself ordains it to be done with. For we can say all the livelong day, that is, if one is saying this, that it was only man who had pitched the modern church, or that it's merely man's religion only working within. But, and once more, as I get into during my aforementioned book, and as I'm going to say more in this book too, man had or has no power to do anything in God's church world without God's express permission or his ordination being given. This is important to understand, and we're finally fixing to get to something here. So think about these following verses while also considering my inserted words, which are going to be in brackets. Romans 13, 1 through 5. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. This is some of my favorite verses here. That is God's power, not anybody else's, or not even the devil's. Why? For there is no power but of God. He's the only power source in existence. The powers that be, if there's a power, they are ordained of God, whether good or evil agents. Whosoever therefore resists the power, God's power, resists the ordinance of God, whether you think it's bad or not. Because God has a reason. And they that resist will receive to themselves damnation. We have to obey God in whatever state that we find ourselves in by the hand of the true master. For rulers, whether good or bad rulers, are not a terror to the good works. Even if they're bad rulers, they're not a terror to the good works, but to the evil. Trials and tribulations to work out evil from within our own selves, without not then be afraid of the power, God's power, even if it's wielded in the hands of an evil man. You do that which is good, and you shall have praise of the same. See, you worry about yourself and what you're doing. But if you do that which is evil, if you take this opportunity to just go crazy and do something stupid, you better be afraid. For he, whoever this is, if it's a bad guy, a bad pastor, or whatever, he does not bear the sword in vain. Again, in our trials and tribulations. Look, we got things to get worked out of us here. God's going to use different means to get it out of us. Because he's a minister of God. He's a minister of God and a revenger to execute wrath upon you, if you're doing bad, upon him that does evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Again, I'm going to explain all the ins and outs of this, of why we may find ourselves under a bad church system, of when it's time to get out of there, but not before we've learned our lesson or God tells us to go ahead and leave. We don't run away from God because of what other men are doing. A lot of people use that excuse to completely leave the church. And they think that God must be bad himself to have these bad people in these churches. That means you don't understand what's really happening here. This is a lot more deeper than what you may think. Do you really think that evil man has the power to do whatever they please in God's ordained churches without God's hand being involved? You really think that? That's like saying that God had absolutely no control over the Jerusalem temple being overthrown to its very foundations by the armies of Rome in AD 70. The ultimate church building. Also, as I pointed out in my book, Blaming God Again, these ordained powers, these ministers, they don't always have to be actual people or actual ministers in churches. A lot of times they are. But they can also be any of life's situations that turns our course into directions that we have absolutely no control over, taking us to places that we would not have gone to on our own, being led by the hand of God. 1 Corinthians 6:20, 1 Corinthians 7:23, and Proverbs 20:24. However, and despite that, sometimes it can be ministerial men that's the force which has the power over us, like I just said. And a lot of times, those men, they can be evil. If you don't think that God isn't guiding their hands, again, not for evil against us, but for our education through trials and tribulations, as I'm going to continue to explain, then please see and meditate on these next verses that I'm going to give. Again, look these up in your spare time. Proverbs 20:24, 1 Corinthians 6:20, Romans 9:20 through 21, Psalm 75:7, Daniel 4:35, 1 Samuel 16:14, Exodus 9:12a, 1 Kings 22:23, and Proverbs 21:1. And the reason I'm not going over these in extreme detail in this book is because in like 3 other of my books, I have gone over and over and over and over of these. On my Evil Side of Creation book series, Blaming God, Is It Really His Fault? Evil Side of Creation, Part 1. And Satan, the Devil, and Hell, Literal Things Are Highly Symbolic, The Evil Side of Creation, Part 2. Especially, I went over all of these verses and in great detail. But in here, I'm trying to get past them a little quickly. That's why I'm saying, go ahead and read them so you can see what I'm saying, so we can get to the meat and taters of where I'm heading at in this book.